Welcome to the in-person inaugural Risks Unfiltered podcast. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Marlene Attzs and thank her for joining us. And I'll allow Dr. Attzs to introduce herself and tell us from whence she came and why she agreed to do this podcast.
Thanks, Ken. It's Friday, yeah?
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me to participate in the podcast. I am Marlene Attzs. I'm an economist by profession. I'm a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And I had the privilege to have read the International Certificate in Enterprise Risk Management during the last quarter of 2022. So that has allowed me to become a little more risk intelligent and to appreciate things and to contextualize, because the nature of my craft, the nature of my profession is that we deal with risks all the time, risks and probabilities and uncertainties. So while I was always aware of economic risks, I think my exposure to the program allowed me to be able to contextualize them and have a deeper appreciation, and of course raise my risk intelligence and now understand the importance of having a risk register and how do you mitigate the risks. I mean, all of the things that you knew in isolation, but I think now I have certainly a more holistic appreciation for them and how you kind of use the enterprise risk management framework to look at economic issues and macroeconomic management, because that is really the core of what I do. So it was very useful for me, and I'm very pleased to be here with you on a Friday.
Great, and that's a nice plug for our International Certificate Risk Management and for the Caribbean Risk Management Academy. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So we are in the middle of a commission of inquiry into a disaster that occurred February 22nd, I believe, where 4 individuals lost their lives. So it would be remiss if we don't mention any impact to the economy, the reputation, from your perspective, Trinidad and Tobago, given this commission of inquiry, which is being viewed across the globe. So from where you sit, and we don't have to get deep into the weeds with this, but from the 30,000 feet level, any impact or potential impact from your vantage point?
I've not been following the inquiry. I know a lot of people are glued to their televisions, looking at it on a day-to-day basis and absorbing all of the information. But I've not been doing that, because the 1 or 2 occasions where I was actually looking at it or kind of following up on it, it was really very gruesome and awful. And from how should I put it? From an outsider looking in, I think there are a number of things that you were correct about. I think there is a significant amount of reputational risk. I think it is clear that it is clear to me that the risks associated with the discharge of the responsibilities were not fully articulated and documented, and it is also apparent to me that there were insufficient risk mitigation measures in place. So you refer to it as a disaster, and one of my lives I do work on disaster risk management and climate change, and a disaster is only a disaster when you have a hazard that meets some kind of vulnerability.
Yes. And
to my mind, in this case, what we're witnessing and what is coming into the public space is really that there were some vulnerabilities, there were some hazards, neither the vulnerabilities nor the hazards were fully documented and appreciated, so that risk mitigation measures were not put in place. So we have this horrific catastrophe that has occurred, and I'm not to sound melodramatic, but I think it is catastrophic because it's not simply the event of the 4 lives that were lost, but the impact on the survivor, the psychological impact on the survivor, the psychological impact on the families, the loss of income, and then having to relive every god-awful moment of that tragedy. And I think it's really just, it's an awful occurrence, and there will be some reputational risk involved. I don't know if it will be at the national level, but I think certainly the companies will find it very difficult to navigate past this. This is fairly significant.
Yeah. And the companies that are interwoven into this catastrophe is internationally known.
Yeah. And the fact, social media, I mean, one of the things that social media is your friend, but social media could also be your worst enemy, and this is being viewed throughout the world.
Yeah. I have colleagues who operate in the space I operate, and they are following it because, like I said to a board member yesterday, you guys still need to go get international financing and international credit ratings. And if this isn't addressed, this being the outcome, so lessons learned, but then what? So today, I think if I'm hearing correctly, the commissioner, the head of the inquiry, basically said that he's disappointed with what has not happened since the event occurred. And waiting for the outcome of the commissioner inquiry. Okay, so let's move past that. But I have some really hardcore feelings as to what should have been done that was not done, both pre and post the event. But that's for a different conversation. The other major impact to Trinidad and Tobago and I dare say the Caribbean is that's affecting the economies of the Caribbean and the potential earning potential is that of crime. And so, and this is a pretty heavy question for you. And so let's take it from the macroeconomic viewpoint. Causation or correlation? Crime, macroeconomics. Where do you see it? How do you see it?
Whew, that's a big one.
And let's bring to bear, and you mentioned it, the fact that you spent 3.5 months being pushed and probed doing your enterprise risk management international certificate. And I think if I remember correctly, you got honors in that. If I remember correctly.
Why you have all my business on the podcast?
I'm allowed. So where do you see that causation, correlation?
Well, it's a two-way causality in a sense. The economic circumstances, I think, are in fact causing some levels of crime, not the kinds of crime that we're seeing. And the crime, of course, is impacting on the economic space. So they know how to manage and how to navigate their spaces. So now the onus is on the other side of the equation. The policymakers and those persons who have the wherewithal to address the crime situation, to now understand the enterprise and understand, therefore, how to manage the risk associated with the criminal enterprise. So that's the first thing that I want to park in a bucket. Now,
let me just interject, and maybe it takes us into yet another discussion point. So it's national, and we know these folks are managed in silos. So should national security be talking to the financial folks?
Well, I think they do speak. I mean, every year.
Are we have causation and correlation, or they're just talking about we need this amount of money to do this?
Okay,
so
well,
that's what I'm talking about.
I take your
right
point.
Where you were going.
There is not an integrated approach to understand that as crime impacts on the face of Trinidad and Tobago, there will be economic and financial outcomes that may not necessarily be aligned to the government's trajectory in terms of where it wants to take the country from an economic perspective. So yes, I agree that there needs to be that integrated approach, and which is why I said from the outset that I think it's crime and the economy, as I reflected participating in that program, crime and the economy is just but one set of issues that I think fits squarely into an enterprise risk management framework, because crime impact is a risk to the economy, and I'm using economy in the most holistic general sense. So it's not just whether or not investors come to Trinidad and Tobago, it's whether people can actually feel comfortable going to work at 10 o'clock at night, whether people are free to participate in religious services that might start at 6 a.m. in the morning, whether children are comfortable going to school because the area in which they live, there is some gang warfare. I mean, and we have the tragic incident of recently, there was some gunplay at a primary school. So I'm using economy in the most holistic possible sense, meaning that as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, each and every one, so from the micro level to the macro level, we're all impacted. So whether if I'm a single parent and I have a security job and they put me on the 10 to 6 shift, whether the area in which I live, I feel comfortable leaving my house at 9 p.m. to go out and get transport. And those are economic considerations that aren't necessarily at the macro level, but the impact on people. So there is cause and effect. And I think that because we are not, we nationally, I'm not a policymaker in that space, I'm not a policymaker generally, but because we're not taking stock of a risk register, so to speak, in terms of crime, in terms of crime's potential impact on the economy, because we're not taking the time to sit and document all of these things.
Or connect the dots.
Or connect the dots. We're missing the picture. So we tend to be looking at the biggest use. So there were 605 murders in 2022. But that's a big ticket item. And whether you come to say that, you know, the cause of a lot of the crime we're seeing is, you know, the importation of illegal guns and gang warfare and drug warfare and, you know, Colombians and Mexicans in the country, which is why we're seeing certain kinds of crime. That is a helpful narrative, but I think we also need to understand the typology of crime. That is but one kind of crime that falls into the big headline items that account for perhaps the 605 murders or some part thereof. But then there are other sides of crime.
Other contributing factors.
But other effects as well. As I was mentioning, the security officer, the single parent who just wants to go and eke out a living. But is challenged to leave home at 9 p.m. because they're too sure what gunplay going and play, you know, on their way to work, to earn an honest day's living. So there are all of these conversations, and I think until and unless there is this, you know, we step back from being defensive, we step back from playing the blame game, we step back from being territorial, and we kind of remove the blinkers and do a risk register. And it's a fancy name, and I think people who would be interested, just sit down and let's kind of like do it ABC style. What are all of the things that can impact and can be impacted by crime? And let's disaggregate and figure out. So I have said in private quarters that with the increase in the cost of living in Trinidad and Tobago, which is now phenomenal, let me get away from being sensational. It is significant. There are persons on fixed incomes who will not be able to survive in terms of the inflationary pressures. It has nothing to do with crime, but it could lead to kind of behavior. So that persons who, conscientious parents, and I want to use conscientious in parentheses because someone looking on at this might think, how could you say they're conscientious? You would do almost anything to look after your family. If you've lost your job on account of the pandemic or because you're part of some cycle, so this is not your cycle to earn income, because you're in one of those seasonal jobs, or, you know, there's a cyclical approach to your job, you might decide that you might go into the supermarket and decide to pilfer milk, pilfer potatoes, because if you boil 2 potatoes, you could at least give the children some, you know, and we have to understand, and that's why I said it's causation and causality, you know, and correlation. We have to understand that as the economy is trying to recover from COVID-19 and all of the attendant noises around that and all of the attendant circumstances that emerge because of the last 2 years, there will be fallout. So I think we need to step away from always looking at the blinding light, you know, the big picture.
Why aren't these conversations being had? And we will have to hypothesize here, obviously.
I don't know that they're not being had. I simply have the feeling that I don't know if the conversations are not being had. I've not been.
Well, let's assume they aren't. Why aren't they being had?
Because I think we're focusing on the big picture.
Good.
I think we're focusing on the big things. So 605 murders, gang warfare, and I think if we
and then to more to that, let national security handle that.
Yes, you know, so for example, if Trinidad and Tobago has had a conversation for years about diversification from the energy sector, diversification into what? Any number of things. So tourism is a thing, carnival is coming up, and of course I pride myself in being a kind of windscreen sociologist and criminologist and all of these things, and we've seen it. The data will support that over the years. Every time you have Carnival, you have Christmas, all of these seasonal activities, everyone wants to participate in whatever way he or she can. So you might also see an upsurge in crime because I may not be earning income, but I have to find the resources to get my boyfriend, my girlfriend, and I say boyfriend and girlfriend because we also need to, I think, appreciate that there is a gender dimension to crime. Some men commit crime because they want to support their mothers or their girlfriends or their child mothers or their children or whatever the case might be. Some women position themselves to be allies for their boyfriend, their man, their whoever it is, to commit crime. And it's all of these issues that I think need to come together in a very holistic way. So that, which is why again I come back, and it's not selling up. It's not a plug for CRMA or the
no,
program.
We'll take it as a plug.
But I think there needs to be a holistic framework.
To drive all of these conversations.
Within which the conversation, so that crime is not about the police or about the Ministry of National Security or about the Toronto Bay Defence Force or about this one or about that one or about who gets a larger budget allocation than whom, as the case might be. It is a fulsome conversation.
It needs interconnectivity, it needs integrating.
Which if you recall, one of my hypotheses or theses or whatever it was the whole of government approach, because I think there is an issue. So one of the nuances we have in the Trinidad and Tobago circumstance is that people sometimes have illegal water connections or electricity connections and that sort of thing, and there might be different circumstances that account for that. But I think I read or I heard that there was some altercation that ended fatally because there was somebody fighting over an illegal connection here or whatever. And all of these things are crime. And if it is you live in a community where you have to resort to an illegal connection either for water or for electricity, one can reasonably deduce that you live in a low-income community.
Right.
So there are links.
There
is a lot of interconnectivity there, and I think respectfully I want to suggest to whomever might be looking at the podcast that until we step back from the whodunit syndrome and are prepared to have frank conversations about all of the issues, all of the attendant issues, all of the underlying factors that result in 605 and counting, because I'm sure is to have some others that probably, however they categorize murders, they will not categorize as murders. So unless we have that kind of holistic conversation, a framework within which we can't identify the causes, we also then can't identify the solutions.
And what's interesting, and so as you sharing those thoughts with us, I'm thinking back to what would I have seen. And again, this is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. It's happening, like Jamaica went across to the US and asked for help. So it's not, it's for the most part it's a Caribbean issue, But so while we are here in Trinidad and Tobago, I remember seeing the criminologists having a conversation, the sociologists being interviewed and having a conversation, and then members of the TTPS and other protective services. What I have not seen is an impact analysis that encompasses all of them. To your words, and I believe if those conversations were being had as we are talking about, it would have been somewhere in the public space, and I could find nothing that speaks to what we are sharing and discussing.
I think there is, as far as I'm aware, there is
in a formal capacity, let's say. So you would have the sidebars, because potentially, obviously, this is kind of a sidebar that gets publicized. But who should be connecting these dots? Who should be taking the lead? Should it be a ministry? Should it be a person? Should they anoint or appoint someone?
That's a loaded question.
Yes, I know. I love to do those things.
Because I think several things from what you were just saying. One, I was invited late last year to an engagement that the police commissioner was having, because from time to time I speak, I'm invited to participate in these engagements. And I was tickled pink because there was an economist being invited. So I said, okay.
A well-known, respected economist.
So I said, well, okay, here we are. We're seeing the light of day because what is happening in the country can't be divorced from the economic issues.
Yeah.
And I remember asking him whether or not they were also engaging sociologists, because I think it's important for us to understand the social fabric and the sociological DNA of the country as well, because they are not divorced. And there were some criminologists present. I think I was the only economist there. There was a statistician, and while we were all brought together, and I welcome the opportunity to have the conversation, I think it needs to move beyond the TTPS now.
Yeah.
So I park that there as a point. I don't know whether or not there are formal interinstitutional arrangements where we have the kinds of conversations among these agencies, kinds of conversations to which I'm referring. But I really do hope that at some point, because I suspect, quite frankly, what is happening is that there is a concern with managing the big picture crime, the lights, cameras, action kinds of crime. Meanwhile, we're not understanding that there are a whole host of other kinds of crime, which is why I call for a typology of crime. I'm not a criminologist, but it is clear to me that there are different kinds of crime that require different kinds of interventions. The other thing that I want to say from a sociological perspective is that when you look at the persons committing crime, it's young persons primarily. If you hear a 40-year-old committing a crime, well, he or she is very unique and is probably fraud or something like that, as opposed to these violent kinds of crimes that you're seeing, or carjackings as the case might be. I mean, so you might have the odd 40-year-old or 50-year-old, but it's really the younger persons, which to my mind, again, suggests that there is a need for a psychological understanding about the different generations. So Generation X is wired differently from Generation Y, wired differently from Generation Z. So you can't have the...
You can't have a single bullet.
You can't have a Azab-Qatif approach to everybody, because what will be a deterrent
to one may not be a deterrent.
Absolutely. In fact, Generation Z, if I remember, because sometimes I dabble in these things, they will actually be very wired knowing that the police are after them, and they will then want to commit more crimes. I was talking to someone once, lamenting young persons, because it's a kind of concern of mine for the next generation, or the next generation as the case might be. And this person who is, professionally situated in security services says, for some young people, it's a real high for them. It's better than drugs, knowing that you have the life of a man or woman in your hand, and you have been given, the task of taking this person out before their birthday. He says that drives some of them, and of course I'm not wired that way, so I find that a little strange. But these are the kinds of issues that I think we need to unearth, because unless we can unearth those issues, then we can't make appropriate interventions early enough. We can only make interventions post facto, after the murder has been committed.
So maybe if we use some police lingo, so your crime fighting technique cannot be just one crime fighting technique or whatever they want to refer to it as. It needs to be targeted. If we go along the same lines of what you're stating there. But again, I go back to the original question. I know we wouldn't answer that question today, obviously, but there are no connecting of the dots. There's no integrate. Both at the, I'm respectfully submitting, both at the policy level, at the political level, and at the institutional level.
To my mind, they don't speak to each other, and there's a very siloed approach. And I think at the end of the day, coming back to your original question, at the end of the day, we're not fully appreciating as a national community how crime could have an impact on the economy, and how the economic circumstances can cause some kind of precise.
I think we have, no pun intended, beaten that topic to death. But let's correlate. Let's integrate. So, a colleague of yours, I would imagine, wrote an article about the inertia of institutions, which, if we extrapolate, is probably symptomatic of the institutions we were talking about relative to causation, correlation, and crime. Okay, and this is a favorite topic of mine when it comes to risk and governance and enterprise risk at the let's stay with the public institution. So, what's your opinion? No, not opinion necessarily, but what are your thoughts around the inertia?
I think the article you're referring to was by Dr. Terence Farrell.
Yes.
And his article was specific to some goings on at children's homes and judgments that had been passed down in respect of the institutional inertia that occurred in those homes. And I would have to agree, yes, institutional inertia, because we usually have a hands-off approach to these things. That's the police problem, or that's the defense force problem, or that's Ministry of National Security problem. Right. And insofar as we apportion blame or apportion responsibility, as the case might be, it stops at the level of the budget. And so we've allocated the second highest allocation from the national budget to the Ministry of National Security or the Ministry of whomever. So our work is done. And it means that when they get those resources, what are the resources being spent on? And the financial resources are being spent on human resources, hiring people, probably being spent on providing them with the artillery, quote unquote, the wherewithal to execute and to discharge their functions. But in terms of cost effectiveness of the spend, so having been given the second highest allocation, have we seen anything in terms of the outcome? Yeah. And the outcome will be a reduction in crime. Right. So to me, in that space is where we're probably finding the institutional inertia in this particular instance, that I get a money, what am I want me to do? And I receive money, so okay, we have plenty of money, as opposed to trying to fix the institution, to ensure that the institution is effective. Right. Not that the institution simply is resourced, but if my mandate is to deal with, I forget what is the to protect and serve something. If that is my mission, then it must mean that having been given the second highest budgetary allocation, I have to be satisfied that with that allocation, I have been able to protect and serve to the best of my ability. But
that raises another question, and maybe there's an answer. So and then we'll move along the government continuum agency side. But if we stay with the crime element of it, are there stated objectives, or do they publish stated objectives? So like if you stay with the Ministry of National Security for a second, or any ministry or state enterprise, are there stated annual, yearly objectives saying, okay, in year one, this is what we need to accomplish year two, and then the leaders being measured against the achievement of those?
Well, I think
from what you may or may not know the answer.
I think in the budget submission, so every year, each ministry.
I mean, wish list. Yeah.
Every year, each ministry will be required to make a submission to the Ministry of Finance for its consideration as it develops the budget on a particular basis. So they will contain some of those elements. Now, whether, and I think your question is really what is germane.
Yeah.
Whether having made that submission and having been given, let's be ridiculous, 100%, which they never get, of what you requested, 50%, 70%, 85%, whether they're being held accountable for that. That is, I think, is an important aspect in terms of whether they have key performance indicators and whether or not they're being held accountable. And I am not aware that
But wouldn't that be a great thing though? Because the whole mantra, what gets measured gets managed.
It's what obtains in the private sector. That's how the private sector measures its profitability. They set benchmarks, they set targets, they set key performance indicators. They say this is what we're going to do. We meet circumstances, extenuating circumstances. The external environment has changed.
And they explain the variations.
Let's come and revisit. Right. Let's see how we can adjust. So that's what happens in private sector organizations, and I don't know the extent to which that obtains in the public sector. So I think
but it should.
I think it should in any any organization, and whether you're a ministry. So a ministry is a ministry, but it's an organization, and there's some key KPIs, operating principles for any kind of organization, we must know what isn't measured. Doesn't happen. Just does not happen.
And then, so it's sort of like bringing us back to the start of the conversation is the value of an enterprise risk management framework, an overarching framework
into which you plug in, and it's not simply about crime and the economy. I think it is helpful.
No, it's
helpful across the board. So
because they're all interconnected, whether it's the Ministry of Labor or Social Development.
So during the recent floods in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a conversation coming out of the floods and the number of people who were impacted, and some people lost their livelihoods, etc., etc., etc. The government making provisions through the Ministry of Social Development for persons to receive relief. And it occurred to me then that if we had, data,
good word,
that would allow us,
good word,
to identify who the vulnerable populations are in Trinidad and Tobago, it would be so much easier, so that arbitrary person A, B, or C coming in and making a claim for costs coming out of the floods, there would be a database where you can actually go in and you can see some historical context for arbitrary person X, Y, or Z that will then support that person's claim. So for me, the enterprise risk management, and to me that is also a risk, because you then find persons who will come up, and every year it happens, every time something happens and there has to be some social assistance being provided, you would hear post facto that there were X instances of fraud and Y instances of fraud, and I'm saying, yep. So
to that point, and then we'll tie everything back in and give you the last word. When one asks about the return on investment of what we're speaking, because developing and deploying a risk management enterprise operational is not a revenue producer per se, though there are opportunities that are derived from that. So it's an expense to the organization.
It's an investment, actually.
Good word, better word. Speaking to an economist, it's an investment. So if it were to cost you $10 to deploy such a program, and you said, it's too expensive, staying with the social development, but fraud is of a 10 million count on the back end. What the fudge?
The ratio doesn't support it.
And we could go back to the current, may their souls rest in peace, bad example, but an example or case study of the Paria disaster. And when you hear of, through the Commission of Inquiry, these experts speak to what happened, what should have happened, what ought to have happened, there were and are major and I publicly pronounced on this, so I'm not saying anything new, major disconnects between each of those parties. So we talk about third party risks, but then there's fourth party risks. So I hire you to do something for me, and then you go and you hire someone else to do that which I hire you for, but we aren't looking at each other.
Supply chain risk.
It is
vendor risk management.
It is. We're speaking ERM terms. Brilliant. Okay, so good conversation.
Good.
Sorry it had to be so short, but maybe we'll bring you back. But I want to give you an opportunity to speak to the listeners, and there are some from top to bottom and in between who listen. A way forward, given all we would have discussed, if you had to give 3 recommendations to the powers that be, what would be those 3 recommendations that could help with the 2 things we talked about? The causation/correlation, and then putting in some sort of methodology or framework to help integrate all these different government decision makers. The greatest risk is the people risks, or are the people risks associated with any environment. To get that integration on point, what would be the 3 recommendations?
I think the first thing, and occupational hazard, would be data. I think if we don't have the data, then we don't know what's happening around us, and it's easy for us to just kind of pull it out of a hat or from other places and kind of weave it around. I think the importance of data cannot be underscored, and in that data, not just the
relevant
economic
data,
not just the economic data, but also drilling down to find out some of the social issues, because a 14-year-old doesn't just wake up and decide to get involved in a life of crime. There are probably things that have been happening behind the scene. Or a 14-year-old who is behaving quote unquote badly in school doesn't just get up one morning and decide to behave badly and then ultimately get into a life of crime. So I think the data is important. I think two, I have advocated with you before the whole of government approach. I think the whole of government approach is also a way of managing risks and identifying risks. But then the third thing I would say, since I know we don't have the entire day and we could talk about this all day, the third thing is really to, whether you want to call it an enterprise risk management framework or any kind of framework, but to accept that we need to have a holistic framework within which we plug in all of the variables. So our major concern now, moving into 2023, coming out of 2021 and 2022, is COVID version, whichever we are into. Inflationary pressures globally that can impact on in economies. But to me, unless we plug all of these things into a holistic framework, enterprise risk management framework is what I will speak of now because of the audience we're having now. But unless we plug those in and are brutally honest, so there's no time for emotion, no space for emotion.
I'm not subjective.
But understanding all of the risks that we can identify, but then also allowing ourselves the opportunity to say that there are other things that we don't know that will come, all those headwinds that we may not be able to identify, and to allow for some kind of contingency planning for those headwinds. What happens if next week President Putin decides that, I've had enough of this toy, I've had enough of this game that I'm playing and I'm, laying down. What happens to energy prices? What happens to the demand for energy? What happens to Trinidad and Tobago's economy?
And the supply chain.
All of those issues. So the contingency, whether it's nearshore arrangements, onshore arrangements that have been put in place, what happens to all of those things? So
one word for that is scenario analysis. But with that, and I'll end on this note. So, which is sort of like where CRMA is heading is more on the psychology aspect, because we have acknowledged that people, those are the decision makers, and people, risk is the greatest risk to any organization. So there's a category of risk called emergent risk, and those are the risks that your experience doesn't help you with. Absolutely. You just can't think about it. Absolutely. So on that note, I would like to thank you, Dr. Marlene Attzs. If it wasn't so formal, I'll get up and give you a big hug for being the first in-person podcast we have ever done, and we've been doing this for like 2 years or so. So I thank you for gracing us with your intellect and your optics. And we'll do this. We need to do a part 2.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was my pleasure being here.
Thank you. Cheers, and let's have some drinks.